All right, how's everyone doing? Got some lunch, got some coffee, good to go. Great to see you all. Great to see everybody joining online as well. Folks back in my home turf are waking up, hopefully waking up to the Devex show here. So great to see you all. We've got an awesome panel, and I'm really excited to speak with all of our guests about the energy transition, and not just the scale and speed of that transition, but also how to make sure it's a transition that works for everyone, and particularly those on the front lines of the climate crisis. So I'm joined by Sara Jane Ahmed, who's an advisor to the vulnerable group of 20 finance ministers, and we've had the pleasure of speaking before at UNGA. Brings an incredible perspective, from that sort of position of a finance minister who's faced with hard choices. Andrew Herscowitz is the executive director of ODI North America, and before that, in a previous life, directed Power Africa at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And Nonette Royo is the executive director of the Tenure facility. So I think we'll have a great, well-rounded conversation here. Just to start, this goal to triple renewable energy by 2030 is really one of the headlining targets, I think, of this COP, and clearly one with an enormous amount of ambition behind it. Sara, I'm curious how the ministers that you advise look at this pledge, tripling renewable energy in just the next few years. Is that an ambition that makes sense for them in the current moment? And has it come with adequate support to make sure that this is a pledge that really applies in an equitable and broad fashion?
So finance ministers are economic managers at the end of the day, and financial or risk managers too. And I think we're seeing, and we know this, that fossil fuels have spelled financial troubles, especially during the pandemic and the wars that are around. And there's a lot of inflationary pressure that governments are facing. So this tripling of renewable energy, I actually, as this target was being crafted, I had a look at the climate prosperity plans of the V20 countries. So we have Sri Lanka, Ghana, Bangladesh with climate prosperity plans, just to see if did the 2030 target, when we maximize the development outcomes, have the tripling. And I'm happy to share that it does have the tripling. So I think the tripling target does match with the development prospects, meaning job opportunities, as well as reducing inflationary pressure. And the other point is that to make the tripling of renewable energy work, the way that we're doing it today is not going to cut it for development. What we require would be reskilling. We have a reskilling challenge, job creation opportunities that would come with the reskilling. And the third point would be a lot of these components are imported. The V20 economies do have opportunities to be part of the supply chain. So those that are manufacturing the relevant renewable energy components or grid components, they could diversify in the developing countries so that it is more inclusive and is a key driver of growth as we try to move forward away from the pandemic and now enter a higher level of warming. We're supposed to breach we're on track to breach 1.5 by 2030. And so with that, we will need more resilient grids, job opportunities, and we will also need to match the energy transition with food security opportunities.
Great. Andy, you've been in a position of trying to make these deals happen and trying to build out a sort of project-based approach to this. When you hear the words tripling renewable energy by 2030 and you think about that experience that you've had trying to put this portfolio of projects together, where do you see the biggest gaps? I mean, what's going to stand in the way of tripling, not just globally, but in the specific markets and countries that we're talking about?
Yeah. So let's start with saying that tripling renewable energy isn't a goal. okay? That's not a development goal, that's an approach. It's an economic projection. It's something that's just going to happen anyway by looking at where markets are going. If you think about it, how much investment is going in to battery factories in the United States? They're gonna have, the market is gonna have, there's obviously economic projections that there's gonna be demand for these things moving forward. My concern though is that the market's gonna push us to tripling renewable energy, which is great, but you're gonna need baseload energy to support that renewable energy because wind and solar both require some sort of baseload energy, and batteries are one solution, but they're not necessarily the least expensive solution. But I'm also concerned that when you look at where the manufacturing for the tripling is gonna take place, it's gonna be taking place in the G20, in the G20 countries, right? They're the ones that have the market, they're the ones that have the scale, and they're the ones that are implementing the industrial policies so that they can produce solar panels, they can produce batteries. And what you're gonna see is that the most vulnerable countries in the world aren't gonna necessarily be able to participate in this massive new manufacturing boom that moves forward. And they'll say, we wanna be able to participate, but you're gonna see an increase in the income gaps between the G20 countries and the least developed countries in the world. And there's this huge temptation to say, we're gonna achieve our climate goals by focusing in these large economies because we can have the greatest impact. But what does that do? It's the same thing that's been happening for the last 60 years in development finance, development space, where you've only had 5 of the least developed countries have emerged from LDC status in the last 50 years. So what is the offer for the least developed countries in the world? And I do have hope that we can accelerate the energy transition in those countries, but that's gonna require a different type of development finance that's fit for purpose for those countries and not the current offering.
And we're gonna dig into what that looks like. And also I should say, I hope we'll be able to take some questions here, so start thinking of those. But Nonette, I suspect a lot of this resonates with you. We're talking about raw materials that are often derived from places where indigenous people live, or from the climate vulnerable countries that we're talking about, and yet the benefit of those actually accruing elsewhere, the sort of extractive approach that has sort of prevailed for a long time. What do you see as some opportunities to get past that, to really sort of achieve the kind of inclusion and mutual benefit that Andy is really presenting as sort of a giant global opportunity here, but that we need to figure out how to realize?
Yes, just before I answer that question, just to say Tenure Facility is a dedicated mechanism that reaches out to indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendants in the developing countries, especially in the tropical rainforest countries. And it reaches out through finance. And it's a larger amount of financing for the next 5 years for every indigenous organization directly to secure their land and tenure. And the idea really is for people to participate in projecting targets. And if they participate with essentially in evidence that they are the ones that should be participating because it's their territory that's at stake. And the territory is in the map, and the map is recognized by government because it's developed within the policy framework of the government that respects those rights. So to answer your question, there are 3 areas that really are crucial. One is partnership, and that really means inclusion. Yeah? So what does it mean? Well, we have to basically look at the land use and talk to the people who will be involved in that land use plan, and then do exactly what is required, respect the process, and consult and talk to those individuals that can provide input and their traditional knowledge. So innovation is the second point here. Innovation does not exclude traditional knowledge, and I think we've all known that. We've said that several times in these meetings. And that knowledge is not easily acquired if trust is not available. And that really looks at essentially passed on from generation to generation some of the insights of the people who are in the area. And we can talk about the details of that, but it has come up several times, and many of the delegations here have talked about that, especially the delegation from the Amazon, because they have examples of it. And the third is finance, and that to us is significant in a way because we're in partnership with philanthropy. And because we receive and give large investments with the communities that could be at the table, that have political capital and talk to their governments and can be influential, it's very important that that then becomes the sort of the de-risking process of the private sector. See, when we're not doing collective work and planning on this, we end up with conflict. And a huge amount of energy and investment goes to waste and in the courts. And many, that's been studied. So this is avoidance. This is actually really preparation. So those three are really...
And also makes the projects less financeable, right? When you have that higher level
Exactly.
of risk. And yeah. But actually, I want to stick with you for a minute. So it seems to me there's an enormous amount of pressure, energy, I suppose, to drive this transition quickly. And maybe it's the case that it's moving quickly, whatever, regardless of what we do or what's discussed in the over in the Expo Center. Does that concern you? Is there a tension between a fast transition to renewables and a deliberate planning process that includes the people on whose land this is going to have to happen?
The thing is, it is really fast now because the pressure has moved and everyone's convinced. It's almost like our net zero and all the work that we've done in the space. Indigenous peoples have felt this. So the idea of essentially pacing with the speed is to just doubling up on conversations and consultations and information. So access to really good information is important for the communities to be able to look at their scenarios. And this is not just information, just, go get it because we need our EIA. But it's really about, okay, what types and what's the level of expertise and the trusted interlocutors in this process that can translate these conversations such that it becomes really practical and meets those needs. Because there are needs out there. Just in Panama, the network of indigenous peoples have told me, now we have our tenure, can we just talk to you about our solar panels and these huge amounts they need? They said 20 years ago, there is a hydroelectric dam upstream. 20 years ago, it hasn't reached us. But we need this for our students to learn, because at night, there's no light. And so what they need is someone to trust, said like, we're not those people. We would like to bring those people to you. So you're like, but we trust you. We don't know how to trust them. So that's not something that we cannot solve. That's something we can solve. There's so many. Philanthropy, Open Society is one of those that we were talking to help, just de-risk this process, impacts investors that are willing and able and want to come in. There's that conversation. It needs to happen. This is complex. I've heard just the problems on its own at that side, but the social side is so important to push the process along. And these are huge territories that are now under their domain. Yeah, so it's those land, territories, and resources under UN DRIP. They can assert those. So then we get into a clash if we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the financial side of this. Africa currently only attracts 3% of global renewable energy investment, and we'll need to double those investments by 2030. Sara and Andy, and feel free to jump in here, whichever of you would like. I mean, what needs to happen to drive more of the renewable investment to the countries that have been left out of that picture so far? Is it a problem with the structure of climate finance, or is it a problem with how the sort of project level investments are being put together?
So I can address that. There are several key constraints, and I'll talk about the three biggest constraints that I see. One is political will, two is capacity, three is currency. And so if you look at when we were doing Power Africa, there was a period of about a year where almost no deals moved forward on the entire African continent. I mean, very few. And you're seeing a lot of the project developers now, instead of trying to do power purchasing agreements with governments, instead they're choosing to do what are called commercial and industrial projects, essentially going to big companies who are tired of dealing with the grid, who are now been given the ability to just produce their own power. So project developers say, I'd rather just deal with the companies than deal with government. So political will comes in two ways. One, you either don't have all the ministries aligned to say we're all going to row in the same direction. And so sometimes having a strong head of state that says, all right, we're all going to do this, we're going to move fast, and it'll happen, and that's what you see in certain countries. Some countries that tend to be a little bit more autocratic, so you have to be careful. Political will also can derail investment in a country, because countries will say, you know what, that deal that we negotiated previously, it wasn't a fair deal, now we're going to force everyone to negotiate. That's the fastest way to scare off investors. Capacity comes in two forms. One, a lot of ministries just don't have enough bodies. I remember we were working on this project to try to scale solar, mega solar with Power Africa in Botswana and Namibia, and I asked my successor, I said, why isn't this moving forward? And he said, the same guys that are focused on trying to scale hydrogen are the same guys we're supposed to be talking to about scaling solar, just don't have enough people. So a lot of countries don't have enough people, and they also don't necessarily have people with expertise in a lot of the areas that so we have to, it's philanthropy and governments and the World Bank, you can help fill that capacity gap. There's demand for that. And the third constraint is currency. So either one of the problems is if you're going to finance a 20-year power project in a country in US dollars, what does that mean? If you look at the currencies of countries throughout Africa, the Ghanaian cedi has declined something like 90% against the US dollar since like 2001, all right? If you finance that project in dollars, but they're charging for electricity in local currency, as the dollar appreciates or the local currency depreciates against the dollar, you have to raise electricity prices. And so the whole reason that you're doing a power project, a public institution, whether it's the World Bank or IFC or DFC, is that you're doing it because you're trying to provide inexpensive electricity in a country that doesn't have reliable electricity. You're trying to provide it to people who've never had access to electricity before. If you're setting up the deal in a way that the cost of power is going to keep going up over time, that's not achieving your development goal. So one of the things I've been pushing for is that we really rethink development finance architecture in the poorest countries in the world, and we do some local currency financing, or at least take on some of the risk of the local currency financing, keeping in mind that the reason you're doing the deal is not to make money. You're not a bank. I'm sorry. The World Bank, really, it's not a bank. It's a public institution whose goal is to do development. But you throw the name bank in there. And then development finance institutions, they all have credit ratings and shareholders all expect some sort of capital preservation. But where is the agency that looks at a development problem and says, all right, I'm going to take some grants and some financing to make the most efficient use of development resources. And we're going to structure a deal that's going to lead to the best development outcome. And I don't care if I only make back 80%. We're going to structure it to achieve the best development outcome. We have to change development finance architecture. That means changing the attitudes of the shareholders, which include, people in the United States, the member governments, and realize, stop trying to make sure that you preserve a return. Do development the way that it should be done. Prioritize the outcome.
Yeah, Sara, what does that look like from the perspective of the finance ministers that you work with? Are those the constraints that they see, the sort of orientation of the institutions that they're dealing with on the development finance side, or is it just the constraints of having limited resources domestically? I mean, what's the where do you see the biggest obstacles?
Yeah, I think in addition to those pointed out, permitting is a key constraint for domestic and international developers. There are about 100 permits. I think in the Philippines, it's around 180 permits for renewable energy and 40 for fossil fuel. So cost of time. The other thing is power purchase agreements. There hasn't been much innovation in the space. There is a risk-sharing element where some of the pricing is paid in local currency, and then maybe 50% is US dollar based. So that means that people are facing higher cost of electricity because they're absorbing that currency fluctuation, which is why, as he was pointing out, the local currency financing element is really critical. And PPA innovation, where there is risk sharing, as opposed to what we were sold by the Western bankers many years ago, is we need baseload contracts or baseload supply. But this is actually just a business deal. What we have is baseload demand, firm demand. So what we need is firm renewable energy to come in. And that requires innovation in the way we contract, and also ways to support countries to, let's say, refinance or maybe swap out their not so good fossil fuel deals that they were locked into, because again, the theory was you need to de-risk the entire thing so that the investor will come in. The other point is grid access. The grids need to modernize. We have very old grid technology in many of these countries, and at the same time, if we look at Africa, there's 600 million people without electricity. That means we need to have 80 million per annum by 2030 to reach that target. So that's a huge target, not impossible, but we need to change the financial system to be more long-term in financing and also local currency. And at the same time, the permitting process, the way we can get renewables into the system have to improve so that all the entrepreneurs in our countries can participate in this. Because for our colleague on the left here mentioned about land tenure and the local indigenous population, they could participate in this transition. They could, in theory, own the plant, maintain the plant, operate the plant. It's not rocket science. I remember I put together a solar contraption when I was 16, so it's not difficult, it's possible, and I think we just need to seriously reconsider who can participate in this transition. It's not just going to be international corporates. There's a lot of domestic corporates who can participate, and people, communities who could be part of this.
Yeah, that's great. I want to pick up on this point about what kind of energy we're talking about and for whom. You know, the scaling up renewable energy does not necessarily equate to scaling up energy access for people who don't currently have it. So what needs to happen to bring those two goals together? You know, one of the sort of underlying bases of this event is that development goals and climate action are sort of increasingly finding themselves in this overlapping space. But in this case, you know, you could presumably triple renewable energy without making a gigantic dent on modern energy access. So how do we make those two things more the same? Sure, anyone.
So this is like my sweet spot, right? I wrote a piece this week that wasn't not meant to be controversial, but it's just trying to be honest about how do you get people access to the level of energy that they need to live a modern lifestyle. So when we think about energy, there's electricity, you know, your lights, and you're charging your mobile phone and watching TV. And then there's energy that you need for cooking, and there's energy you need for heating and cooling and for more productive uses. And so a lot of the solutions that are offered, the small solar home systems, are fantastic for lighting and mobile phone charging and television, but it requires, like, you can get by doing that with like an 80 watt or even a 40 watt panel. It requires 700 watts of electricity to boil one pot of water. And you've got 3 billion people globally who still use biomass, charcoal, and wood for cooking. And so you need to come up with cleaner solutions. And while gas is not an ideal solution, it's better than chopping down a tree, which then has a carbon impact, and then burning that tree to turn it into charcoal, which has another emissions impact, and then burning the charcoal for cooking. And so we have to think through, how do you get people, at least from a transition standpoint, until the grid can get to them, or a sufficiently inexpensive mini grid can get to them, that they can have a productive modern energy lifestyle to increase their incomes, which then allows time for some of the more innovative solutions for the cost curves to come down, and then we can truly have, you know, a renewable system. But the other key point is, I've defended fossil fuels. I've described it as, right now we're more in the Toyota Prius stage than the EV stage. You still need a little bit of gas to get where you need to go. You need baseload power in order to sustain solar and wind, which are both intermittent sources of power. You need to make sure that there's electricity available when the sun goes behind the clouds. And so you've got renewable forms of power, of baseload power, in geothermal, which the Philippines has and the East Africa has, in hydropower, nuclear, where there's not so much. And certain countries in Africa are blessed with those renewable forms of baseload power, but they're not interconnected to the countries that don't have those forms of renewable baseload power, which is why it's absolutely critical that you focus on the cross-border transmission infrastructure. We will see a point when you don't need the fossil fuels for modern energy future, But until we focus on building the infrastructure and taking advantage of all those renewable forms of baseload power, we're not going to get there. And you're going to have to continue to use other dirtier forms of baseload power to sustain the grid.
Nonette, do you want to jump in on how you sort of think about the connection between land tenure and access to energy?
I think the question of access and accessibility is an important one. There's a realization in the remote places that they need access to energy, but their needs are not as big. And they do have, and several, EFAD has many projects, they even awarded one from the Cordillera, where the community is very happy in maintaining its own mini hydro, and they're spreading because there's so much modeling of this that they could essentially pay to keep it. And so capacity is being built, the upstream rivers are being protected, the watersheds, so there's kind of, it's interconnected, and they're just showing themselves, that, they're giving themselves the confidence that this can be done. Now, of course, there's the other part of this. So what are the aspirations? What are the needs that then the other energy systems can feed into? But for now, especially for the transition, I think we're learning as well. So we can contain, and these are the types of needs, and other types of needs are for the future. But for now, while we're waiting for that to happen, it can be done. So I think
mini hydro is such an exciting solution, though, I think. A lot of people, it's being underutilized because there's so many rivers and streams out there, and because hydro provides baseload power, it's a way of providing the type of electricity that people actually need to meet all of their needs. So.
Yeah. So there's that. And yes, so I think there's a meeting point here. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, of course, there's also our own needs that we probably need to sort of look at. Yeah. Right? Our own consumption needs. Yeah.
I'm curious to hear how you all reflect on the COP process. I mean, let's sort of bring it back to Dubai for a second. Lots of discussion on climate finance. Do you see this COP process bringing us closer to an energy financing system that works for people in communities that have been kind of left out of the renewable revolution so far? And whether or not you do, what's still missing from the conversation, the financial conversations that are happening here? Sara, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. So I think for the COP process, it's the only space where a variety of groups can come in. Like, usually we're not in, V20 is not in the G7 meetings, the G20 meetings. We don't have indigenous people entering those spaces, but everyone is here at the COP. So I think this is why it's important to set the targets and the trajectories of where we want to go. But what's also, I think what's missing is that the discussion around wealth and development is not really maybe front stage. It's more about emissions, which is good, important for developing countries that we stick to the 1.5. At the same time, there's so many, we can actually reach a sharper, I think, cut down in emissions by maximizing development. And how we do that is maximizing renewable energy wealth. Solar, wind, geothermal, all of these, composition or portfolio of renewable energy. I was meeting with St. Kitts colleagues, and they've just found almost a gigawatt of geothermal opportunities. And I suspect the renewable energy wealth opportunities in developing countries are far more than what we think. And with that, this issue of variability may not be as big an issue as we think, assuming we look into a optimal portfolio of technologies. But this will require the grid operators to really use technology. I mean, it's not like we can't predict wind or solar. We can. This is how countries that have more of that are able to bring in another technology to fill if there's a gap. We also see in the small island grids that are mostly diesel, they could have solar and wind and then use the diesel as backup So this transition,
They also could use, and I think like there's long duration energy storage, which
yeah,
which I think the islands are the perfect place for trying to deploy and scale those technologies.
yeah, there's a lot of innovation in the battery technology as well. I mean, I think just generally, like, we should try to figure the composition of technologies rather than focusing on one thing that's supposed to replace this other thing.
Andy, when you were at AID, the president decided that this was something that required an initiative to sort of build out. To me, that sort of suggests that there was a void, right? And I wonder where you see kind of the most promising institutional work in this area on, building out an energy project portfolio like the one that we're describing. Where is that taking place? And do you see the sort of system shifting in the right directions?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that was special about Power Africa was that we had a view over all of the different US government agencies, and we tried to tackle problems from a transaction by transaction approach with a very common goal, saying we're going to try to get megawatts and we're going to get connections, and everything's going to be focused on that. So we could take a deal, for example, there's the Kapeto wind farm in Kenya that had gotten stuck. OPIC was providing financing for it at the time, and had gotten stuck because there was an issue with a migratory bird species. And so we said, wait, we got to pause on this and figure out how we mitigate this issue. So AID was able to step in and take some money and pay for that plan. And it was important that aid pay for that plan and it didn't fall on the project developers, because if the project developers had to then come up with this money, it would have reduced their return and would have made the project less attractive to them. So a lot of people will criticize saying, well, you're just going to subsidize private sector. It's like, no, you're not really subsidizing private sector. What you're doing is you're leveraging private sector. You're getting them to do deals that they otherwise wouldn't do, because if they can't make the numbers that they need to achieve on a transaction in Kenya, they will turn back domestically to the US or go someplace in Asia or Latin America. So you really do have to have this partnership where you're working hand in hand. Everybody's bringing something to the table. I'm going to share just one quick story with you. I tell people when Power Africa, when I was there, we helped 120 power projects worth $20 billion get across the finish line. And it only cost us $500 million to do that. And everybody's like, wow, that's amazing, like a $1 to $40 leverage. If I were to tell you that when I was at DFC, we helped 120 power projects get across the finish line worth $20 billion, but we lost $500 million on that portfolio, everyone say, why did you lose that money? It's the exact same story. It's the exact same story. So the DFIs and its shareholders need to get past this idea that they need to be at capital preservation in a few percentage points. They need to be willing to think of that money as leverage for getting the private sector where it needs to go.
Last chance for, yes, we have a question here.
Thanks very much. I have a question about blended financing, actually. About 2 weeks ago, before COP happened, we convened a virtual roundtable, and we brought together 15 stakeholders, and they were the Global Environment Facility, the Climate Investment Fund, the World Bank, many of the UN agencies, CPI, Convergence, etc., all of them at the table. And I think a couple of them actually said, how come we didn't know that you were doing this and we should be collaborating with you? So what came out of it for us was that there's a realization that while we have a very complex challenge that is global in scale, that is a system, we need to take a systems perspective in addressing it. I feel like it's a very fractured global ecosystem. So the information is not shared among all the key stakeholders. I mean, these people are holding the key to unlocking hundreds of billions and even trillions of dollars. So why are they not coordinating and talking to themselves, among themselves? Why do we have to wait for a COP event to happen? So what, from your perspective, can be done at the global level to diagnose where those gaps are and how to bring the right stakeholders to the table?
And then presumably ministers of energy and finance have to figure out how to navigate that whole fractured system as well. So yeah, great question.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to, when you asked, where's the space where everyone can be informing each other about where they're at, where are the gaps, and what would be a good way to carry this forward. We still speak in our own silos, and somehow we are very comfortable with that. And the idea for this meeting is for us to, but then we have our side events. It's really, you can imagine, my experience is that we just run from event to event. So where is this place? And I think that would be up to some of us to actually think about that it's an open space, and maybe it's like this, but it is like you provide more time and have really concrete conversations.
Yeah. Last word to either one of you? No? Sarah, on the fragmentation piece of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the process, the access, they all have different processes and access points, so it's challenging to navigate. It's a lot of cost and time effort. I think if these banks, investors, banks, DFIs can get together, MDBs, and just have like a standardized way of access, I think it'll alleviate some of the pain on the side of the government or even private sector that are trying to access these.
Great.
So my last words would be, stop chasing announcements, chase results. And results aren't numbers, they're not dollar figures. I don't really care how much money you've committed, and I don't really care how much money you've spent. I want to know how many people have gotten jobs, how many people have gotten access to electricity, how many tons of carbon have been emitted. I don't care about numbers. Numbers are absolutely meaningless. And all of the financial institutions and everyone, how much money they're going to leverage and do this and that, just what are your results?
Great call to action. All right, please join me in thanking this panel.